Hopefully you have a handle on the standard material at this point, and we can go ahead and explore some of the other material types. Open the bowl sample file. This material is assigned to the bowl, and it's currently of the standard type. Change that to Raytrace. The Raytrace material is much more complex. It has more components, and you can use it to simulate objects that have accurate reflections and refractions. But some people really get into this material and they use it for everything. Be aware that it's going to take longer to render because everything that happens with this material has to be ray traced. I recommend going to the Raytrace Global settings up here. And here you can control the maximum depth, which by default is 9. I've set it down to 3 to accelerate the ray tracing process. The anti-aliaser will slow it down, but will give more accurate, smooth results. I'm going to leave it off. Note that you can disable ray tracing globally by unchecking this. And there's also a message window that will appear when you're ray tracing, and I find that a bit distracting, so I turn it off by unchecking this. So I'll go back to the material and let's work with some of its properties. Notice that it has a number of shaders up here. I'll choose anisotropic to simulate glass, and I'll turn on the background. I'll make it more reflective, and notice that many of these controls have multiple functionalities. Right now I can set a color for the reflection, or if I uncheck this, I can set a percentage, or if I click it again, we have a third option, which is Fresnel, which would be good to simulate glass. I'll leave it there. I'll make it more transparent by using a percentage. I'll make it 85% transparent, which is good for glass. Notice that the viewport tries to represent that, although it's not very accurate. I'll turn on active shade to get a more clear look at what's happening here. Notice that this takes time because it's having to ray trace it. Now, I'll use an environment map to simulate the objects around the room that are going to be reflected. I'll use reflect refract, and that will change the reflection slightly. In a moment we'll be able to see it. There we go. Perhaps I'll use a bump map to simulate some surface relief on this glass. Smoke is a good bump map. This is going to be too much. I'll set it at a size of 10. And before we have to wait for that, I'm going to close active shade, make the change here, go back up, and turn this down to 5%. Then I'll go back into active shade. Because ray tracing takes so long, you might be better off not using active shade and just doing test renders periodically. The extended parameters give you some special effects, and the Raytracer controls are similar to the global controls that we saw in that separate dialog box, but this is on the material level, so we can enable or disable ray tracing within this material. We can also set a fall-off end distance, which will accelerate the process a bit if we use these options. But notice it does take a lot of time for every change that we make. Ray tracing was extremely popular a few years back in computer graphics, and there was a company that created dedicated hardware called a render drive. I recommend that you Google that phrase, render drive, and you'll find ArtVPS, which currently sells this hardware, which can greatly accelerate the ray tracing that you do. And it works in Max and in Maya.